Brexit's been a failure, but not because we've left the EU. For me personally, it's been a failure because the benefits we could have got from leaving the EU have never been grasped.
We just need to figure out how to put competent people in office. And former newspaper columnists like Gove and Johnson are perhaps not the best people to have running your country.
I've not spoken to anybody yet who was at the heart of the Brexit referendum, who was an integral figure, who knows what was going on, who was pushing it for years. I mean, I've always been a Brexiteer since I was I'd say a mid-teenager, leaving school, going to college. I didn't know why I disliked the EU, but I knew I did. So when the referendum came along in 2016, it was the easiest cross I ever put in a box. But you were there, you were pushing for it, you were fighting for it. What can you say about that period in time?
Well, I was against Britain being in the European Union long before I ever got involved in politics. In fact, it's the reason I did get involved in politics. I could see that organizing a continent of 500 million people by top-down design was going to be a disaster for that continent. So I advocated for Britain to leave the European Union. When I first stood up in the House of Commons, my maiden speech, I called for Britain to leave the European Union. That was back in 2005. And there were a grand total of 6 MPs in the entire House of Commons who believed in what then became known as Brexit. And I basically went into politics to try to get Britain out. I advocated for a referendum. I had to switch from the Conservatives and join UKIP. Famously resigning my seat in a by-election for UKIP in Clacton, now Nigel Farage's constituency. I pushed for it. I co-founded Vote Leave, the official campaign, with Dan Hannan and Matt Elliott. And yeah, it was the reason I was in British politics. And I'm absolutely love to talk about the inside of it. I would just say one thing. The referendum, I've met an awful lot of people who are keen to talk about the critical role they played in the Brexit referendum, which is great. It's good. It's good that lots of people feel a sense of ownership of it. But I think viewers should treat with caution any one individual who claims that they were responsible for Brexit or the Brexit referendum. It was, after all, a decision taken by millions of Brits. So if you're one of those people who voted for Brexit, thank you. You were as much responsible for it as anyone else.
No, and I agree with that. We can talk about battles, we can talk about wars, we can talk about world wars. One person doesn't win a war. One person can contribute to the winning of the war, but they need so many other people alongside them contributing as well for that victory. Now, Brexit is happened now. Let's not discuss the ins and outs of what happened there. What I'd like to ask you now is, I'm glad we've left. I would never want to rejoin. I'm the first to say that Brexit's been a failure, but not because we've left the EU. For me personally, it's been a failure because the benefits we could have got from leaving the EU have never been grasped. They're sat there on a shelf. It's Christmas, so they're our Christmas presents for the future, wrapped up on a shelf that someone can grab down at some point in the future. That's how I'm looking at it. Am I wrong? Am I mistaken?
You're absolutely right. I mean, leaving the European Union gave us the opportunity to run our country in a very different way to the European Union model. The European Union model is a failing model. It's very highly taxed, very highly regulated. Leaving the European Union ought to have allowed us to do things very differently, to become a much more free market society, to become a country in which you don't need permission to create wealth from politicians and officials. Instead, tragically, although we got self-government, we put in charge of governing us a bunch of Muppets. People like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, who are notionally in charge of the Vote Leave campaign, not only failed to use the Brexit opportunity. I mean, look at just what happened after winning the referendum. The day after we won the referendum, both Boris Johnson and Michael Gove made a speech at the Vote Leave campaign HQ, and they didn't really seem to have anything to say. it would be obvious that they should then take up the role of governing the country and implement some of the vote leave policies. Again, they failed to do that. They got into some petty spat, as a consequence of which they put in the calamitous Theresa May, which led to 2 or 3 years of disaster. Even after all of that, in late 2019, when Boris Johnson finally won a majority to make Brexit happen, in office, he proved abysmally disappointing. He implemented an energy policy that has basically priced the UK economy out of growth. He failed to take advantage of free trade policies, allowing officials to dictate what a free trade agreement ought to look like rather than what it should be. Again and again and again, we found that post-Brexit ministers simply weren't up to the job of governing. And I think this speaks to a wider problem. When you as a country gain self-government, if you haven't had it for 40 years, which we hadn't, lots of the basic elemental parts of statecraft, of how to govern a country, have been forgotten. And now that we've got self-government, we need to figure out how to reform government so that we're capable of governing ourselves, but governing ourselves well. In order to try to achieve this, I set up a project called the Good Governance Project. I could see what was coming, having quit my seat in the House of Commons after Brexit was secured. I set up something called the Good Governance Project, and we advised Boris Johnson, both in opposition and in government, on how to re-engineer Whitehall, how to make sure that the dysfunctional British administrative state was up to the job of government. And I'm afraid to say Boris Johnson and all the rest of them had zero interest in doing that. I could see that post-Brexit, we had a series of Muppet ministries in charge. And I'm afraid they singularly failed to take advantage of Brexit. It's a dismal story, but that doesn't mean that Brexit is wrong. Eventually, we will figure out how to govern Britain competently and wisely. So don't despair. It was never going to be easy becoming a self-governing independent country. We just need to figure out how to put competent people in office. And former newspaper columnists like Gove and Johnson are perhaps not the best people to have running your country.